Don't tell me that the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass. Hello and welcome to Shining Moon episode 17. I'm your host, Deborah L. Davitt. Today we're departing from genre concerns to talk about the art and craft of world building. My guests today are Marie Brennan, Beth Cato, Rachael Handley, and Kenneth Hite. Let's start with some introductions. Marie Brennan is a former anthropologist and folklorist who shamelessly leans on her academic fields for inspiration. She recently misapplied her professor's hard work to The Game of 100 Candles and the short novel Driftwood, along with several poems and over 80 short stories. As half of M.A. Carrick, she is also the author of the Rook and the Rose epic fantasy trilogy, beginning with The Mask of Mirrors. For more information, you should visit her on swantower.com, Twitter at swantower, or her Patreon at swantower also. There's definitely a theme. She's got really good branding. You can always find her. Thank you for being on today, Marie. It's wonderful to have you back on the podcast.
I'm astonished you're willing to let me be here 3 times, but I appreciate it.
Nebula Award winner Beth Cato is the author of 1,000 Recipes for Revenge from 47 North, plus 2 fantasy series from Harper Voyager. Her next book, A Feast for Starving Stone, will be released in January. She's a Hanford, California native now moored in the Driftless area, usually with 1 or 2 cats in close orbit. Follow her at bethcato.com and on Twitter. We still do Twitter? Okay, at bethcato.com. Hello, Beth, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, and I am a Nebula nominated. I am not a winner, alas.
Oh, I am so sorry. Did I read that wrong? Oh, well, perhaps one day it'll be accurate. Perhaps this year, who knows?
Doing some world building right now.
Appreciate the vote of confidence.
Yeah, we just went into alternate reality. I apologize for that.
I like that alternate reality.
I like that alternate reality too. We should totally go live there. Rachael Handley is a queer disabled fiction writer, fiction poet, and academic based in Dublin, Ireland. Their work has been published by the Liminal Review, Arlen House, Dreich, 365 Tomorrows, The Magical Press, and Ellipsis Zine. Their debut collection of short stories, Possible Worlds and Other Stories, has been published by Ellipsis Press imprints in September of 2022. I'm sure there's more that has happened since then, but we will get to that in due time. Hello, Rachael. It's nice to meet you in person at last, as it were.
Thanks so much for having me on. I'm super excited to chat to everyone.
I'm really pleased to have you. Kenneth Hite has designed, written, or co-authored 100 and more role-playing works, including GURPS Infinite Worlds, Trail of Cthulhu, the Dracula Dossier, Knight's Black Agents, Bubblegum Shoe, which I love the title of, and Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition. His other works include 2-volume Tour de Lovecraft, Cthulhu 101, The Thrill of Dracula, The Cthulhu Wars, and the Nazi Occult for Osprey, the Lost in Lovecraft column for Weird Tales, and an annotated edition of Chambers, The King in Yellow, as well as 4 Lovecraftian children's books. Half of the Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff podcast, he lives in Chicago with 2 Lovecraftian cats and his non-Lovecraftian wife, Sheila. Hello, Ken, and welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Deborah. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here, finally.
I'm so sorry that we weren't able to include you previously.
No, that's all right. It was my ridiculous schedule.
It happens. Believe me, I understand. We're going to dive right into the questions, and we're going to start with the simplest, or possibly the most complex question, which is, where do you start with building a brand new world? Which is a huge question, and it's going to probably take some unpacking. So I'm going to start at the top with Marie, and I'm going to say, where do you personally start with a new world? Do you start with how it diverges from our reality, like alternate history? Or do you start with a single image and go from there? How does it begin for you?
It varies from story to story, but probably the most consistent answer for me is that when people will sometimes ask, "Oh, do you start with a plot or with a character?" My two smartass answers are, "I reject your false dichotomy," and "I start with the world." For me, it's very common, especially with short fiction, I would say, that what happens is there's some cool bit of world that suggests a plot and a character to me. And so
Mhm.
what I start with is that little nugget, but that nugget could be anything. It's not that it's, oh, I always start with figuring out what the, environment looks like or the, religion or something like that. I've got one beginning of a story drafted, which isn't going to be finished until I figure out where I'm going with the plot. But for whatever reason, I don't remember what sparked this, I had the idea of a world where if you touch an object that belonged to you in a past life, you get memories of that previous life. And so the plot that was suggested by this is that it goes very wrong with the protagonist's daughter and her recently deceased, very abusive mother. That like the mother's personality takes over the daughter because she's been reincarnated like that. I don't know where I'm going with this conflict, but from that idea of you get these memories, other things start branching out. That like there are flea market type places where you can go to like finger through lots of different objects to see, were any of them yours and are you going to get a memory off of it. And the idea that you don't go to these places until you're a certain age because it's better not to get those memories until you're old enough to kind of cope with them a little bit, which is why
Mhm.
it's a problem with the young daughter. Just stuff builds outward from that starting point. So for me, where do I start? I start with the thing that gives me the idea for the story, basically. And it could be a whole wide array of things because I love reading anthropology, history, mythology, all these, different things that for me are a very rich source of those inspirations.
Fair enough. I find that it very much varies from story to story for me as well. Beth, how do you get started with it? Because there, in A Thousand Recipes for Revenge, there are so many different little things that are different from our world, but it's all an integrated tapestry. I was wondering where you got started for that novel, for example. What was the starting point?
Usually for me, it's a matter of a basic plot. Like basic, like this is what this character is, and these couple things happen. But from there, for me, world building is everything. And because my recent novels have all been very strongly historically based, it's a deep dive into research. That is the
Mm-hmm.
first thing. And it means going online, trying to find primary sources from the time period if I can. Archive.org is a really good source of really old, out of print things like For a Thousand Recipes for Revenge, 16th, 17th century English cookbooks of French recipes. Things like that. Lots of old books. Just nice thing about writing about a secondary world that's based on Musketeer era France is that there are lots of books out there that go into the history of French food, which is such an onerous burden to research, having to read about all of this fantastic food and integrate it into the world. But since but I have a main character who is a chef with a capital C, and she deals with cooking magic. So trying to bring in all of these authentic historical details about cooking as it was in that period without colonialism and its influences, I really wanted to get those details right. And to me, that's what makes it really rich world building.
Yep, research definitely counts, and it definitely it creates an aspect of trust between you and the reader, because once you've established your bona fides in that way, they realize that they can trust you and they can go a little bit further into this new world with you. Ken,
Yes.
obviously, with you primarily develop worlds for games. And the more intricate the world is, the more people can get into it and bounce off of your ideas and create their own things. Where do you start?
Well, my glib answer that I repeat on my own podcast every chance I get is start with Earth. Because in role-playing games, there is a sort of a tradition of starting in these sort of deracinated fantasy worlds that, maybe it's like, this is kind of like Vikings, but there's no, connection to anything that anyone cares about unless they've read a 300-page book of backstory. And my argument is no one cares about a 300-page book of backstory. They already cared about Vikings. Start as close to Vikings as you can if you want Vikings to be the cool thing that you're doing in the game. So I start with Earth, and then secondarily, I like Marie's idea of starting with the sort of the central concept. And in my case, it's what is the game about? What are you doing in the game? So for the Dracula dossier, I started with the idea Dracula is an after-action report of British intelligence. And the unredacted version of that falls into the hands of the players, and now they're in a spy thriller. And so everything sort of comes off that central concept that is the core idea of the game. It's why you're playing this game instead of 50 other games. And it's harder to do with a deracinated fantasy world because there is nothing that particularly special about your elfland that isn't true of every other elfland, but something that is got a central story or a central conflict or a central activity for the players to do. That's what you ideally, in my way, should be building the world around. And again, as you say, as a game designer, I'm primarily doing setting. I don't have the option of doing characters and plot because the characters are the player's job and the plot is the GM's job. I'm literally just building worlds and building setting, and I kind of have to do it as deeply and as excitingly and as story producingly as I can. So, it's sort of like the opposite of Beth. I'm not looking to avoid bad things in my universe. I want bad things in my universe because that's what causes adventure and fiction and danger and all the things that role-playing games are about.
Absolutely. I like this mental image that I have of you basically having a telescope almost, and you have it aimed at Earth, and you're putting these filters in place over the top of it and seeing what details pop out from it. I
very
like
much
that.
like the optometrist. Better like this or better like this? Or in this case, worse like this or worse like this?
Rachel, how do you get started? Where is your starting point at?
I would say like my starting point is very similar to Marie's. Like usually it's an image that pops in, or it's just one particular thing. So it's usually just the image pops into my head, and I think, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what will happen with that. As if it's not my job to then go write that and figure that out. And I just kind of experiment with that image. Like, so it could just be, like it could be a particular world that I end up imagining. Like, what if it were the case that we're all alive, or something like this. But sometimes it's just like a piece of dialogue or that kind of hints at what that world might be or what kind of situation I'm actually looking at. But usually it's a very short snippet of whatever it ends up being that's always the starting point for me.
Understood. Yeah, I'm somewhere between all of you. I do use in-depth research. I do use my academic background to sort of feed into and draw things out from. I do start with an image every now and again, and it just becomes a web. And that sort of leads me into my next question, which is where I often fall down because I want to build and build and build and build. And I have so much world in my head, and there's only so much space for it to be on the page in a short story. How much world building is the right amount for the length of story at hand? I'm going to bop back up to Marie, because I know that you have like an entire, role-playing game and several novels worth of stuff for Rook and Rose. How do you determine how much of that to unleash on the unsuspecting reader when you're only writing a short story?
Well, okay, the short story specifically, because, when it comes to the novels, the reaction we've had from some readers is too much, is, how much we've put in there. But it depends on what the reader's looking for. I would say, because I was trying to think of a way to give a useful answer to this, because it's not like we have units of measurement for world building, right? And so how do you define quantity even? And what I landed on is that regardless of the length of story, what I personally, as a reader, like is enough world building to make the setting feel textured. And that's the word that best for me encapsulates the feeling of, it's not just that it has the cool idea at the center that is making the story go. It's that there are the bits around it that make it be not just, and then fill in stock imaginary setting here, but that there are the little like tasty bits of flavor sprinkled through where some particular side detail gets world built just a tiny bit, especially in a short story. You don't need the whole explanation for why do they plant trees over people's graves instead of putting headstones or something. That's actually a detail I put in an unpublished novel of mine, that they plant yew trees. Like, why do they do that? It doesn't matter. Just mentioning that detail of like, oh, I'll go, put that in front of my parents' funerary trees or whatever. And I go, ooh, trees, that's cool. Like, that's the stuff that makes the setting feel to me like it is real, like it has, sensory qualities beyond what is required for the plot. I love stories that put those into the corners. And so for me, the amount of world building is the amount that gives it that three-dimensionality, that tactile feeling, so that it feels like it comes to life in my mind.
One of the things that I've been told about my novels is that they tend to overwrite reality for people, because once they come out of it, they're still thinking poured stone as opposed to cement and things like that. So
yeah,
that's the right amount of world building for a novel length. But when I'm going to be trying not to drown a reader in a short story, it's again, that optometrist. Is it better this way or is it better that way? Maybe okay.
Yeah.
And now that I'm over 6,000 words, it might be time to cut out some of the details.
Yeah, and
Beth?
certainly,
I'm sorry.
if I can just add,
Sure.
so the Patreon that I've been running for like 6.5 years now, it's all about world building, and it's about digging into those corners of like, what are the things that could be world built in a setting. And even in a short story, there's constantly little details passing through that, yeah, I could world build that. I can't do all of them. It's true. Like, if I took every single, like, oh, well, the characters are wearing clothing, therefore I should talk about the clothing, and the characters just ate a food, I should go into detail about the food, and there is music, and I should talk about the music. And, like, you can't do every bit of it. So you do still have to pick and choose which are going to be the most, like, flavorful bits to drop in there.
Yeah. And Marie, and we're going to take that, we're going to go to Beth, because obviously flavorful is where she lives.
Yeah.
How do you orchestrate your recipe for the perfect short story? Because you have been in Chicken Soup for the Soul numerous times. You are a master of flash fiction. How do you world build in such a small space but so effectively? How do you know how much world building to put in that immerses the reader and then lets them go again after such a short amount of time?
No matter the length, it is all about having the ability to write a rough draft that is total crap. That's really what it comes down to. It's like if I'm writing flash fiction and I know my end goal is for, say, a codex contest and it needs to be 800 words, that means it's okay if my rough draft is 1,500 words. Because I'm trying to figure out the story, I'm trying to figure out my characters, and I can cut from there. And I can make it concise, I can make it tight and functional to make it work for the ultimate length. It's the same with longer short stories. It's the same with the Chicken Soup story, which is basically, it's autobiographical, but there's a tiny bit of fiction element to it just because you've got to make it fit in that 1,200 word count space. But, it's all about writing that rough draft. And for a novel, it means just, it's a stinky draft. It is horrible. It's, and I hate writing rough draft novels. It is a prolonged process of high anxiety for me, where I'm trying to push out as many words as I can each day because I know the thing is inherently broken and it drives me bonkers. So I'm always so glad when I have that initial draft done, because then I know, okay, I already know I need to fix these things. And as I read, I know I'll find a lot more, but now I can go back and I can fix it. And that's when I look at all of that world building, where I do throw in, like Marie was saying, all of those details about all of the food, all of the clothing, all of that texture that's so important. And that's when I cut. I'm like, okay, I'll leave this bit here, but I'll move this about the clothing to here with the characters in better light. And I swap things out, or I realize, no, I really don't need this paragraph at all. It's superfluous. And, it's all about finding the pacing for that world building. And that can mean switching a chunk out from one chapter to another, or even moving it to another book sometimes. Mm-hmm. And where it is the hardest to figure out the pacing for world building, I would say, is when it's a sequel book. Because then you're not only doing the world building, but you're having to somehow incorporate what happened in the previous book or books.
Yeah.
And that is so difficult. In every book that I've had to write a sequel for, presents an entirely new, horrible challenge in that regard. And that was one thing when I did a Feast for Starving Stone. I actually wrote a synopsis of the first book to put at the beginning. And I wish I'd done that for all my other books with sequels, because it made it so much easier, because I don't have to try and squeeze all those details in to the main narrative. There it is right in the beginning to refresh people's memory if it's been months or years since they read the other book. And it made it so much easier for me.
Yeah, I definitely highly endorse the synopsis at the beginning.
Yeah,
not just for the reader, but for yourself, because
Yes.
it is depending on how long it's been since you wrote the first novel, it may be very useful for you to go back and go, oh yeah, that happened.
No,
Yep,
I've seen more
exactly.
of those summaries lately, and we did them for the Rook and Rose books. Amen. I think they need to become common, because it makes pacing the story so much easier.
It really does. It really does.
Ken, you obviously don't have the question of length of story at hand, but you do have to know how much world building is the right amount for a game, because some games are meant to be one shots. Some games are meant to be full length campaigns that will be played over the course of months or years. How much world building do you do for a one shot versus for a campaign, and how do you know when you're done?
The amount of world building or setting detail, whatever it is, for a one shot has to be enough. I mean, this is my goal through everything. One shot, source book, whatever. My goal, which I admit I don't always hit, is that every sentence should inspire play at the table. There should be no waste sentence in the thing. No one should be reading my connective tissue. They are here because they need actionable, fun to have. And so I come closer to that in some books than in others, but that's always the goal. So for a one shot or a single adventure, you really have to sort of make sure that you are, establishing what is 1937 Cleveland like in as few sentences as you possibly can, to put people into that spot so they can move forward, but also so that they have leverage and they can think, well, the cops corrupt or are they not corrupt? And you have to be able to answer that question, ideally by introducing an NPC who is a corrupt cop. And all right, okay, I get it. And then you can build out that sort of feel of the adventure. So it's very much, I imagine, like, set dressing in an original Twilight Zone, where there was just going to be that 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And that's all we're ever going to see of William Shatner on that plane or whatever. And everything has to say what's happening, what's going to happen, what's this going to feel like. And so that's really the goal with a single adventure is, I mean, like everything, there should only be, playable sentences in there. But for a single adventure, it really has to direct you and drive you to not a specific course of action necessarily, but to a specific, feel and choice universe, right? Is this a place where I need a gun, or do I need to fast talk people? And that should be, made apparent as you go in. So you're describing the bar, and is it a friendly bar? Is it a working class bar? Is it a fancy bar? Are you going to get in a fight in this bar? All of that needs to be established in as few sentences as you can, because the job of the adventure is to sort of support that play that the players are doing.
Yeah, I like that as a response. And when you're dealing with a campaign level or a full setting book or something like that, obviously you can have a little bit more connective tissue, but you obviously will have way more NPCs, way more pieces of setting to deploy, and it can be a more varied place.
Yeah. And when I have written short stories, it is a constant urge to over-explain, especially if you do it in an alternate history. You want another story the same length in the back, where you just give the timeline, or you have the horrible thing that happens in all alternate histories, where the character looks at a map of the world for no reason. You just have to discipline yourself and say, no, that is bad. There will be no as you know Bob moment in this story, and you just have to pull it out. And so you might be able, I did a short story called Bad Beat for Aaron Burr that took place in a world where Burr's revolt was succeeded and he took over Mexico. And so you just have to sort of establish what the setting is like as you go past. So it's like James G. Blaine is on the dollar coin, and you're all right, that was a thing, and you just move forward, and you just have to have these sort of like I think Marie was saying, these sort of impressionist moments that give you a sense of a bigger world outside the constraints of the story. And that's something that I look for in a short story or in a film even, is this story going on outside Bill Shatner on this plane, or are we doing really just a stage play? Nothing wrong with stage plays, but you really, I think, for a work of prose fiction or a role-playing game, especially for prose fiction, you need to feel that world is big and extends off the side. And if you took a left turn instead of a right turn, you'd be in a whole different story.
I totally agree with that. Rachel, how much world building is the right amount for you? How do you balance it?
That's pretty tough, because I think that it's going to be different from story to story. It just depends on how well your reader is going to connect to the characters. So like in certain stories where there's only a little bit of kind of a speculative element, I might not need to do that much world building at all. In other stories where the whole thing is completely different to what anyone's ever experienced in real life, then there might need to be like a much bigger, might need to be a much bigger effort in terms of like the world building itself. I honestly, I don't think I get to choose that much. Like I kind of feel like when I'm writing it kind of does it for me. Like I know which perspective I'm writing from, and that character ends up kind of informing me of, you know, which details are going to be relevant. I think a lot of world building is the difference between what's normal for your character versus what's normal for the reader. And writing from the character's point of view rather than the reader's point of view. So again, it depends on your perspective as you're going in. As long as it's different from your reader, you're probably going to have certain elements of world building according to different characters and so on.
Yeah, character-centric focus does tend to change what your camera view shows. I completely agree with that. And as somebody whose characters talk to her in her head, and I mean that in the best possible way, not in the please take me away to the nice place with the white coats and everything like that. I let them determine sometimes what I'm telling. So yeah,
same. It's like to some extent it feels like it's up to them. It's kind of like, oh, okay, I'll go do that now.
Apparently, I'm talking about this now. I'm following your directions. I've had characters who decided that something that I had written in the outline was stupid, that they were not going to do it, and I was insane for having suggested it. And I go, you're right. It was dumb. I won't do that. We'll get there a different way. And so, the characters are pushy, but sometimes they're absolutely right. All right. We already sort of covered my next question by talking about how do you immerse the reader in this new world without drowning them in details. We sort of already covered that. But do you want to say something about that, Marie, anyways?
Yeah, because there are... A chunk of this is basically a question of craft around how does the exposition happen? Because it's not just about how much information is in the story, it's how are you presenting it to the reader. And this one is interesting to me because I know what I personally like as a reader, and it's what I do in my fiction. And we get readers, especially for the Rook and Rose books, which, you know, Publishers Weekly called our world building tediously detailed. So go us. Alyssa and I are both anthropologists, so we did a shit ton of world building for that one because we like it. But some readers adore the way that we handle it, and others are drowning because it's not that we don't explain to you how things work and what they mean. It's that you won't be able to say, yes, the explanation of that is on page 17. because we do it through contextual clues and through how the characters are interacting with something, rather than there being that moment where you can find the like 1 to 3 paragraphs that just lay out for you how does this work. And obviously we talk about info dumps being a bad thing, but it's only an info dump basically if people don't like the scale of how you're explaining. I've heard that with Tom Clancy thrillers, like they are massively info dumpy, and that is what Tom Clancy's readers show up for. That is why they are reading this book.
They do.
Yeah. But like, I think probably a lot of Sanderson's readers, from the impressions I'm getting from reviews and discussions I've heard, they want us to explain more because they are used to reading books where there is much more of and here is the explanation. And it's scaled to a level where they like it. It doesn't feel like an info dump to them. But Alyssa and I would rather, because the Rook and Rose books are co-written with my friend Alyssa Helms, with those, we drop you into it and you will get the clues you need along the way. And some readers drown. Right. So it's partly taste and it's expository technique of how are you doing things. Like, I won't even usually put like an appositive after a noun. What I'll do is I'll structure the sentence such that, he put his hand on the hilt of his kabash and, took comfort from the feel of the sword or something. Like, I put that rather than his kabash, comma, a sword. Like, it's going to be later in the sentence. So I think that there's actually a high level of craft fiddliness that goes into that question of how do you keep the reader from drowning.
I like that answer. I personally, I've been accused by some people of explaining too much in my Edda Earth books, and I'm like, I came out of fan fiction, and I had lots of people who were sending me emails saying, I don't understand this. So the next chapter would be my explaining this to them, and they would come back to the chapter after that and say, we still don't understand it. So the next chapter that would be more explanations, explained a different way from a different person's point of view. Did you get it this time? Okay, we got it. So I'm used to having to hold the reader's hand a little bit, but there are different ways of doing it, as you said, where you can put it in subtly as opposed to necessarily having a full page information dump. And I used to read Tom Clancy when I was a kid because my dad was reading him. And I recently tried to pick up my dad's old books out of, wanting to feel a connection to my dad again. And I realized I can't read this anymore.
Well, I guess the third way is the Tolkien. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Go for it. The Tolkien way.
I was going to say the third way is the Tolkien way, where you put it all in the appendices or in the Silmarillion, which no one reads. And then you've done it for those fans. Right. Yeah. But mathematically, no one reads it. But you've done it for those fans, and then everyone else can sort of go along and pick it up or not out of the sort of established, inferential way that Marie's talking about. And if you have that kind of space and that kind of luxury, I mean, that's the advantage of being a role-playing game designer, is we're writing the appendices. We're not writing the Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
And so we almost have the opposite problem, is how do you get people to pay attention to what they should have read back in the little text box that said, oh, by the way, everyone in this is a vampire, without, saying, Armand bit you like vampires do because he's a vampire. Remember the text box? You have to sort of just hope that people are pulling out, the vital pieces of information. And for that, I don't think that there's a better way rather than the appendix, the preface. So in a, you're going to do this story, you set it out, you say, okay, game master, here's the actually important stuff that you really need to know to run this. We're going to mention it again, but here it is. So it's sort of the opposite of your, why is this not on page 17? It is on page 17. It's in the index. Yeah, explanation, comma, page 17. Go there. And that's sort of the opposite job that we have in presenting story, because we're trying to enable. It's almost like we're trying to, do a story Bible for the writer, as opposed to doing the actual story in that case.
I was actually just thinking this story Bible thing, that if it's a setting I really love, I will be interested in going and reading that extra material, but the story itself still needs to contain enough explanation for me to follow, right? It can't be like, okay, I'm going to drop this in here, and the only way you'll understand it is if you go read that appendix. Like, then in fiction, the author has failed. Games are a very different beast in that regard. And I'll admit, I ran into the experience of not having, read that sidebar or in fact much of the thing. A friend of mine was running a Numenera game. I absolutely wanted to play in my friend's game. I wasn't that interested in the world of Numenera. It just isn't my aesthetic. And so I mostly hadn't read the book. And so stuff comes up and I'm like, okay, I have no idea about this.
That sounds very Numenera-y.
That's when you play the amnesiac character.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
We actually were all amnesiac. The GM decided to say that all of our characters had amnesia to kind of explain why we didn't know the world.
That works. Just to continue on the role play thing and how you develop things and how you point the reader to information. I've been looking at a game called Teeth. And this is a Forge in the Dark hack that is much more extensive than your typical hack is. It's set in 18th century England, but there's waves of corruption moving over the land and things like that. The way they decided to set up their book is every couple of lines as they're building their world, as they're building this NPC, it has footnote, see this page and that page. And then there's 2 lines later, see this page and that page. So it's this backwards, forwards, constant movement through the book. And I'm like, while that's very thorough, it to me is like, can we please just have me sit in one place at a time and find all the information in a linear fashion, as opposed to having to scroll, because I'm reading this in a PDF. I can't just have my finger on one page and constantly flip back and forth. It's definitely better for a physical artifact than it is in PDF form, which is something that people also have to think about when they're designing games and when they're designing books these days. Is are you publishing electronic? Are you publishing hybrid? How are people going to experience this? But that's tangential, so I'm going to rein myself back in, and I'm going to go back to Beth, and I'm going to say, how do you go about immersing the reader in this new world without drowning them in details? How do you find that balance for yourself?
First of all, I want to say a big pardon if there's noise. I have a thunderstorm going on right now, and it is dumping rain outside. So if you hear any background noise, that's what that is. So I've been trying to mute when other people are talking, so it doesn't interrupt the feed at all. So with that said, for me, I think an important facet that hasn't come up yet, when it comes to the approach and getting the world building right, voice is one of the most important things. It's like what Marie was saying with the approach that they use for those books. If you having that tone, almost an academic expertise, and having that tone, it works really well if you're phrasing things and if you're approaching it that way. And I guess you'd have a different kind of academic approach if you're doing some gaming materials. It depends on how immersive it is and how it's written. But yeah, I think having voice and having the format for the voice also matters. It's like, I just did a story for the first time that was very experimental for me because I used the epistle format. Everything was done in the form of letters that this character was writing to their mother. So it was kind of trying to find the balance of, I didn't want a whole lot of, as you know, Bob, kind of segues to bring information, but still keeping the tone and making it sound like it was written by someone who was in the late 19th century and having that kind of vocabulary and that kind of flow and using that to help me piece the information. It's like, how much would someone in that time period say about this subject matter? You know, it really helps inform how much you put into the story, because you do have to think, like Deborah, like you were saying, sometimes the characters talk to you and sometimes they're very chatty. And sometimes if you are the great author god and you try and get them to do something and they say, nope. It's like, oh, okay, I plotted this out. And they honestly would not do that. I screwed up. Character, what would you do? You listen to what they say and then you go from there. But you've got to heed the voice. You've got to make it feel like it fits within the world. Because if you try and force them to fit into a plot, it's going to come through. People are going to recognize it. It's just not going to work.
I've unfortunately read books that were clearly written by somebody who had an outline from 15 years ago, and they decided to not listen to their characters, and they had lost the thread of where the characters were, and they're trying to force them through the paces of the outline, and you can tell. You can absolutely tell. It's sad. I'm going to be skipping over my last question, so I'm going to just go to Rachael to try and finish this off with how do you immerse the reader in this new world without drowning them in details, and then we're going to move to each other's stories.
Yeah, I guess, again, I mean, I would agree with Beth in terms of the voice, and like I was saying before, what the character is telling you to do. And again, the perspective that you're writing from becomes one of the most important things, because it's about what makes sense for that perspective. And if that is what the reader is engaging with, then if you're doing it right, if it goes well, then there shouldn't be too much or too little. I do quite like kind of contextual building, so I quite like world building where I leave a bunch of stuff out, but that it's so normal for the character to do that at that point that makes total sense. That's what I really, really like. And I like reading stuff like that as well, because as a reader it feels a little bit like a mystery, but in a nice way. Not in a I am drowning kind of way. So I guess, yeah, again, it's like it's all down to the character and kind of what feels right for that character and interaction like between them. And I was just thinking when we were talking before, that one of the ways that TV shows go wrong is when, you know, in the last season you're just thinking a character wouldn't do that, they wouldn't do that.
Yes.
And it's kind of like it's the same kind of thing, right? It's like, yeah, you just haven't taken on board all of this world building and completely wrecked it. And it's like it's a very similar thing.
Yeah, when a different group of writers comes in and suddenly the characters are acting like pod people, it is definitely disconcerting and very disheartening. And that's usually when I quit watching. So,
like Community.
All right, we're going to move into the section of the broadcast where we talk about each other's work. We're going to start with Marie with The Naming of Knots, which appeared in Beneath Ceaseless Skies, issue 388 on August 10th of 2023. In this novelette, I'm going to say the name wrong. Segas?
Segas, yeah.
Oh, good. I got it right. In this novelette, Segas is a thief, and a good one, out to rob the rich and make himself less poor, when mid-burglary, his entire sack of loot is stolen from him by the legendary thief known as the Rook. The Rook has a proposition for him. Come work with him. In exchange for getting into a fortress filled with information that requires a second person for the job, the Rook will give him information on a variety of targets amongst the wealthy elite of the city. The Rook is famous for not killing, but plans to make a public example of the nobleman who allowed a bridge to fall into the river, killing 53 people and contaminating the water supply for everyone on the lower banks. The story is replete with details from the Rook and the Rose worldscape. The gods have both faces and masks, which they might turn towards you. The city is rife with corruption and greed. The Rook, an established character, meets with a new character who speaks in a lower-class dialect that sounds smooth and unforced. How did you go about fitting this piece into the Rook and the Rose puzzle? Because obviously you have to work hand in glove with Alice. Alice? Did I say it right? Alice, thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, so I wrote the story myself. This one wasn't done collaboratively, though Alyssa read through it and gave me comments.
Okay.
And it's funny because probably if you looked at it, you would think, what happened was that Marie decided she wanted to write about that bridge collapse, which is a background thing in the novels where they're trying to fix what went wrong with that and replace the thing that cleaned the river that got broken by the bridge. And in fact, the story came about because I wanted to make the Rook stand like a companion cube out of Portal on a pressure plate. We had done that in the role-playing game that gave rise to these books. I remembered that image. I wanted to make that happen, so I needed a plot to make it go. The challenge really was that I did have to make a lot of decisions about what not to include here. And it's a similar sort of thing like when writing historical fiction, because in a sense, then there is a very detailed canon and a very detailed setting that has been, already made for me by history, and I have to decide which bits of it go into the story. When I was working on editing this with Scott Andrews, the editor of Beneath Ceaseless Skies, there were things where, he kept on pushing at why could the Numenor that cleans the river not be replaced? He wanted an explanation for that. And I'm like, that requires me to mention another entire magic system I'm trying not to stick into this story, and it involves a bunch of complicated things about the interactions between those magic systems. You do not want me to open that can of worms, Scott. And so it was very much, again, about, that that really fine-grained craft thing of finessing the sentences that present this can't be done in a way that will just leave the reader with a feeling of like, okay, there are reasons. I don't need to know the reasons right now. And there were other places where Scott was like, oh, rather than just saying the metal of this Numenot, I think like bronze would be a really good idea for this. I'm like, no, it can't be bronze because reasons of magic system. It's a made-up metal. I'm not going to mention the made-up fantasy metal that exists here. So leave it alone. Yeah, so there was a lot of stuff where I had to be like, that is just gonna lead us down a path of more detail than I think this story needs. But one thing that I will say about it, because this is again some of that, how do you, get the exposition across to the reader? A lot of the story hinges on numinatria, which is one of the forms of magic in our story. And I deliberately set it up such that the first thing you see Tegus doing is having to figure out like a kind of like a puzzle lock almost for getting into the building where there's a Numinatrian defense. And so he has to get past that. And by taking this piece of world building and making it a problem he has to solve, that gives me a very natural reason to go into detail about how it works. So a chunk of your how do you get this detail to the reader is if the characters are arguing about it, or it's a problem one of them needs to solve, or something where you make the world building a thing that is a point of conflict, then that helps you a lot with explaining stuff.
I did that a lot in Edda Earth because I have multiple magic systems, and so one of them is basically summoning and evoking spirits and working with ley lines and things like that. And then you have the more sciencey sort of ones where they're working with atomics and things like that. And so I have two characters who are constantly sniping at each other about which magic system is better, and then they can explain why they're better, because therefore we have a perfect excuse to talk about it.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to move to Beth with Prognostikiso, which appeared in the late lamented Daily Science Fiction, July 29th of 2022. In this flash piece, a narrator owns a cheese shop and can tell fortunes by the crumbs left behind by her customers. A young woman accompanied by her boyfriend comes in to ask if they have a future together given his history of aggressive driving. The narrator gives her the bad news that he's about to cause an accident with his driving, and as she glances down into the remnants of the girl's cheeses, realizes that the accident he causes is about to kill both of them. She hustles the girl out of the way of the shop window just as a car from her vision crashes through it. In terms of world building, fortune telling isn't a secret in this world, which is otherwise indistinguishable from our own. There are signs up warning people that their futures will be read, sort of like, the signs that we see saying this is under surveillance, cameras in use. There are actual security cameras and insurance plans and more. How did you decide on this blend of the fantastic and the mundane?
Well, having it take place in kind of our world, our reality, it makes the world building a lot easier because a lot of that initial structure is in place, especially for flash fiction. I mean, that makes it a whole lot easier. When you're working with 1,000, 1,500 words, you can't go into the big, deep alt history. You've got to keep you have to have a very small cast. And you have to be very focused.
I keep trying.
So that made it easier. So that meant my focus in this story was entirely on making the magic around cheese plausible. And it really is like the reading of tea leaves, except it's reading cheese crumbs. Because why not? So I was able to have fun with that and what you can do with that. And anyone who knows me knows how much I love cheese. It's like, well, of course you'd write something. And I have to say, this story has one of my all-time favorite titles.
It's a fantastic title.
It's a wonderful title.
It's just so funny and fun. And you know exactly what the story is about just from the title, because it's prognosticaso. It's prognostication and cheese. I mean, it's all right there.
Right. Leaning on what history has already established for you, as Marie said before, is a wonderful way to, and then you just diverge in little ways. And then you come back to it. And so you are making this little outline around reality and having their interstices that connect you back to reality. So your reader's more willing to go with you. I like that. It works perfectly in this piece.
Thank you.
Rachel, The Spaceship of Theseus, which appeared in Full House Literary. This microfiction is just 354 words long. I counted. There's a creeping sense of horror evoked as a sentient ship that has taken humanity to the stars, and from there back home to Athens, slowly rots in the atmosphere of Earth. Pieces of it are replaced, a play on the ship of Theseus philosophical problem, until its mind is removed from its body and placed under glass in a museum, where it can only beg passersby to notice it. This is a particularly dark and evocative piece. It's remarkable for how much it packs into such a short space. A lot of the world building is left to inference, as you said that you like to do. It's not mentioned, for example, why humans had left Earth to begin with, or why they were now permitted to return. So there are these pieces that are missing, and the reader's mind just sort of bounces off of it, going, "But I want to know more. I want to know more. Why is this not being explained? I'm going to fill in details on my own because that's what I do. Because I'm a human being and I have patterns and I have pattern recognition." If you'd had more space, would you have included those sorts of details, or why did you choose to leave them out if space wasn't an issue?
Yeah, so like with that initial story, when I first wrote it, I did just want it to be a kind of a riff on like the philosophical thought experiment. It obviously got very dark as it went
but wonderfully
on.
So.
Yeah, like I really like it, even though it's kind of like bleak. But so like originally I wanted it to be like that, but I ended up putting it in the short story collection Possible Worlds, and I ended up connecting it to one of the other stories in there that actually gives way more context. So I actually got to eat my cake and have it too, because I got to go back to that story, like maybe like a year after I actually wrote it, and just kind of went, ooh, this would work, and this might explain why this is going on. And it actually, yeah, there's like a huge like there's a series of links through several of the stories in the collection, and that became one of them. So I got to do that,
lovely.
which is really cool. But when I first wrote it, I was just thinking, I wonder what it would be like if we put like emotion and character into this thought experiment that already exists. And the thought experiment is just this ship is being replaced bit by bit, and the question is, can we have personal identity over time, and how much of us needs to be replaced before we're not the same person? So that was like the starting point, and then I kind of went, okay, but what if the thing being replaced is something that is recognizably a person? What if it's from that perspective? And then yeah, I just kind of went off from there, and obviously went super bleak.
No, it works beautifully. It works beautifully. I can't believe how much you managed to pack into such a short space. It's a really well developed story. All right, we're going to bop back to Marie Brennan with Constant Ivan and Clever Natalia, which again appeared in Beneath Ceaseless Skies, this time in issue 373, January 12th of 2023. This is a delightful story simmering with world-building details. Constant Ivan sets himself a task to receive a prophecy from the moon turtle, but then reasons out that since there are two moons, there must be two turtles. These turtles, once he's reunited them for the first time in long ages, give him a prophecy that he'll move what's impossible to move. And when he hears about a caravan wagon that cannot be moved without the proper horses, he resolves to help the woman who owns it. Clever Natalia, not knowing that this is actually a test to find a new leader for her caravan. He finds sea horses, the horses of the dawn, the horses of dusk, and finally a horse made from the bones of the mountains themselves. And Clever Natalia, on seeing them and him, and his steadfastness and courage, decides he would make a decent leader for her caravan if he chooses to stay with them. So this story is infused with a strong sense of Slavic folklore, but I know you do your research when you write. Was this based on any particular folk story? Or did you come up with it whole cloth? Because it fits like with a click in my head. Like this is something that has to have been established previously. This fits so perfectly into the Slavic folklore tapestry in my head that already exists. Is this whole cloth yours, or did you base it on anything, or how did you come up with it?
It's not based on a specific story. It is definitely based on motifs that show up in folklore. Like I refer to this story as me going Full Metal folklorist, because we had come up with this idea of this story because the Constant Ivan and Clever Natalia thing gets referenced in the Rook and Rose books as sort of like the interaction between two characters mirrors it a little bit. And so we had the idea of this story, whereupon I thought, why shouldn't I write it? And I leaned full on into the folklore that in traditional real world folklore, generally it would be that clever Natalia is setting a challenge for her suitors. But Alyssa and I decided that it shouldn't be quite so, the woman is the prize in this contest kind of feeling. So it's altered from that a little bit. But things like, he, gets the horses from the 4 directions and they are not normal horses. And don't ask how physics works here because that is not the point. It's a folk tale.
That's not the point.
Yeah. But it feels very Slavic because that's what the names are modeled on, but the underpinnings of it are really just more broadly stuff that you see a lot of in European folklore. And yeah, it was entirely a thing of, we had come up with this narrative as part of the banter between these characters, but in order for the banter to be fully comprehensible, we needed to know the story it was referring to. And now that we knew the story, why shouldn't the story get written? So it was really just fleshing out a corner of the world because I love folklore. That's really all it boils down to.
Well, it comes across and it's beautiful. We're going to, again, in the interest of time, because I know that at least one of us has to leave relatively soon, we're going to only do 2 more stories, and then we're going to do the reading from Beth Cato. So we're going to pop to, I'm having such a hard time deciding between stories because they're both wonderful. We're going to go to Beth Cato's The Recipe Keeper, which appeared in Flash Fiction Online, January 2022. I have read this one before. It is wonderful. So rereading it for the podcast was just a lovely revisiting. So in the story, the humans in an alien world have been subjugated by alien conquerors who forbid them memories of their own culture, executing them for using their own language or singing songs from Earth. Against this backdrop, a woman exchanging recipes with other humans has to keep them in her own memory, pure oral transmission, nothing written down, and runs the risk of being caught and killed for her actions. In terms of world building, this could be modeled on any number of resistance movements here on Earth, which certainly informs and gives depth to the setting. What gave you the direct inspiration for this story?
For me, it really came down to legacy and culture and what's passed down, what's important to us, what makes us, what forms our culture at a basic level. And like you, in your synopsis there, bring up music, is a major facet of that. But for me, because I love food, I have a recipe blog, and that's just a subject that I share a lot online, and it's something of great personal interest to me. It's about recipes and personally what they mean to us and how they're passed down, and food and how food is made and what ingredients are used is, it's something I think a lot of people don't consciously think about, but it is a major source of control. And it is a major source. If you read about colonialism, controlling the food that people were given is huge. It's like, in our modern world, people think of Navajo fry bread or Indian fry bread, depending on where they are in their country. And they think, oh, this is Native American food. Not so much. It is because when they were forced onto reservations, after the great majority of them were killed on the travails getting to the reservations, they were supplied with all-purpose white flour and baking powder and salt and things like that, and oil. What can you do that? You can make a basic bread and drop it in oil and fry it up. So it's completely a result of that really horrific past. And now it's unfortunately the most well-known Native American food in the country, and it's something that is really only invented was only invented in the past 100 years or so. So thinking of things like that from our world, it's not hard to translate that to science fiction, even in a flash format, because I think everyone understands recipes and the importance of food and family gatherings, and then adding the danger to it, where it's this dangerous thing to know and share. To me, it makes sense. There's a logic to it.
Yeah, there absolutely is. And this is a tangent, and I promise I will make it brief, but you talk about food as a method of control. One of the things I learned about in my sociology classes was about cults and how cults will maintain a specific diet, which is very high in carbs and very high workload at the same time, but it's this free, fast energy, but then it leaves you with nothing that your brain can process. And so
Yep.
you're in this constant state of mental exhaustion because you're being physically worked and you don't have any of the resources that allow you to have long burning energy and so on and so forth. And so,
That's a great point. Yeah.
food
The
is
denial
control.
of food is also part of that. Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. All right, so we're going to move to Rachael again with The Sound, which appeared in Sonder magazine in April 27th of 2022. In this flash piece, the people of the world become aware that plants around them are singing, though it sounds like screaming. The rural folk hear it first, the people in the cities only later. They actually go on little tourism jaunts to go try to listen to the screaming, because it's this "why won't you perform for me" thing that the city folk have. Only when people begin to sing back to the plants does the incredible riot of noise begin to fade to a whisper. This could be our world. In most respects, it is. How would you say that you world built the differences? And you're on mute.
It's bound to happen to one of us, isn't it? So I think that, like, in terms of building the differences, part of it was like kind of borrowing from what the world is actually like and how people do interact with things. So one thing I was thinking about was kind of like people going on safari or people going to zoos and kind of like looking at the animals and kind of like tapping on the glass and going, "Hey, go do, hey, go do something that entertains me." And it was kind of from that, really. And what I wanted to do in there was like, the reason they think the plants are screaming is that it's so loud that people's ears start to bleed, and it's real bad for human beings that this is happening. And I kind of like the idea of what if the things that we think are kind of just there for our entertainment get their revenge. And that was basically it for me. Just giving them a position of power rather than just being, just observing like a nice plant or a nice tree. And that was really the starting point for it.
All right. We are going to move on from our Mutual Admiration Society to talk about The Last Banquet of Temporal Confections by friend of the podcast, Tina Connolly. It's appeared in Tor.com in 2018. This is a spectacular novella. This is my second time through it, and I had read it when it first came out, and so reading it again for the podcast was, again, a lovely experience. In this novella, a pretender has taken the throne of a kingdom and has taken hostages for the good behavior of his cooks, among whom is Danny, a baker who's learned how to use the magic of rose time to invoke memories in those who eat his confections. His wife, Saffron, is the hostage for the good behavior and integrity, serving as a food taster for the Duke. Each memory on display at the banquet is linked to others, telling the story of how Saffron and Danny met, married, and failed to resist the traitor king until the day that the king decided that he wanted their confections in his life and would stop at nothing to get those delights for himself. In the end, it's a confection that inflicts on you all the pain you've observed that sends the traitor king into a coma, allowing the kingdom to reshape itself in his unfortunate absence. I'm going to turn this over to you guys, and I'm going to start with Ken because he hasn't had a chance to talk in a little bit. When you were reading this, what did you find that she did effectively to make this a second world fantasy realistic and hit home for the audience?
I mean, I have sort of and I may have alluded to this at the very beginning of my bit, I have sort of an allergy to secondary worlds because when I read something like this, I think of Michaela Ressner's wonderful Medici cooking fantasies. And I want to say, why is this not on Earth? Why do we have to have a fantasy world? Why can't you just put this, in, Italy or Germany or any other place where there are awful kings and cool cooking? Why does it have to be in a fantasy world? And so part of the problem for me and even really good secondary world fantasies trigger this for me. When I was reading Lies of Locke Lamora, I spent the first third of the book saying, why are we not in Venice? What is wrong with you, Scott Lynch? And it took me so long to get past that. And this is, perhaps my damage, but whatever. I was exposed to the Ill Earth War at an early age. And so when I'm reading it, the world building for me almost it's effective. Obviously, it builds this world of food magic and the rest of it, but the world building is almost like someone has gone to a very great degree of trouble to build a one-for-one model of something that I already have. And so I feel like the world building, the effect of it is, and I don't want to harsh on the story at all. The story works very well, but the world building per se, always with secondary world fantasy, strikes me as almost wasted effort, because with probably a great deal more effort, as Beth can speak to, you could have done this same story, with real places that I actually have an emotional investment in already, as opposed to just, I'm sure Danny and Rosemary are wonderful people, but it's like, you really have to be in some sort of way either doing a deliberate fairy tale like Marie's story, or One for the Morning Glory by John Barnes, which is maybe the only secondary world fantasy I've truly loved, since whenever. But to have a secondary world that just sits on its own is it's like watching someone do, an interpretive dance. It's like, I'm sure that's great, but it's not my vibe. And so that's part of the problem with it for me. And I don't want to, bag on the story, because the story it's structured well, the characters are great, everything else. But, maybe because I'm so professionally consumed by setting, my reactions are a little idiosyncratic on this.
Well, that's fair enough. Everybody has their own taste and their own interpretations.
Yeah.
I will say that when I was attempting to read Loch Lamora, I didn't have the reaction to the setting. I had a reaction to how he was telling the story, and I wasn't able to finish the book because of it. Because every chapter was ending on a cliffhanger, and then we would change to the past, and then the past would end on a cliffhanger, and then we would go to the future again, and we would end on a cliffhanger. And I was sitting there going, "I know exactly what you're doing. I know why you're doing it. I don't like it. Leave me alone."
It is the hazard of reading as a writer, that you see the machinery going sometimes.
It's a terrible fate, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. Well, maybe on my worst enemy. But...
Yeah. My husband tells me that I am a terrible person to watch TV with for the exact same reason. Beth is raising her hand in the background. All right, so I'm going to turn to Marie, since you do like secondary world fantasy.
Clearly.
Try and salvage the hideous dump I've put this podcast into.
I'm definitely coming at it.
Like?
So one of the things that I did notice, because I was thinking about world building as I read it, is that with short fiction in particular, there's a lot more leeway to just kind of put a detail in and not have to work out all of its implications, because those implications are not this story. And so, in particular, the kind of central conceit here, that there is this herb rose time, which, if you prepare it properly, can give you different kinds of memories and so on. We don't have to worry about what the effect of that is on society in a bigger sense. Like, where does this fit into, I don't know, religion or something? Or, how does this affect, history and the way that they remember it? None of that matters, because it is entirely here to serve the purpose of, there's a pun, of this banquet, where this is being used to create a certain arc of effects, and you get the exposition about the history through the effects of the herb and so forth. So, yeah, those larger implications of it don't have to be considered, because it is a piece of short fiction. We're more willing to accept that it's just not going to go in those directions. Sort of contra to Ken's comments, though, I don't know, in a way I think we wrap around to agreeing, because there is just enough of the politics built to make the story go, and no more. And so, yeah, there's not a lot of depth put into, the dynamics of the politics in this world. There's just like, here we basically have an evil usurper. That's what you need to know. Beyond that, details aren't really provided. And certainly if they had been provided, then you would be turning this into a novel very rapidly. It doesn't need to be a novel.
Yes.
But that part of me that likes the textured, detailed world, that I could give a long answer to why are things secondary world, not rather than history, but that is not this podcast. I like that kind of.
It could become a podcast.
we can get to that episode later. I do like the things that take it away from the real world for aesthetic reasons or thematic reasons or whatever. But yeah, this is very much built around its core purpose, and it's detailed because there are multiple steps in that process. process, but it's not, or rather it's long because there's multiple steps, but there's not a great deal of kind of surrounding detail built in.
Mm-hmm. Beth, what did you like? What didn't you like? And what did she do effectively to make this secondary world built to your satisfaction, or not?
Well, for me, I love this, and when you were asking for story suggestions, it's one that I was like, oh, I vaguely remember reading this years ago, and I had to dig up the link to it, and so I read it again 2 days ago, and it was the first time I'd read it since it first came out too. So that was nice to get to have an excuse to revisit it, because I've known Tina Connolly for over 10 years now, because we were both there and on Codex in the early days and all that stuff. For me, what really works and what is kind of the core of the story is the emotion. It is a story that is really about emotion and memory and ties that into food.
Yeah.
Which for me, with my background, what I write about, that's, no wonder I like that about the novel.
A slam dunk for you.
It really is. I will say that one thing that stood out to me rereading it now, 5-6 years after it came out, and I think just I guess being deeper into craft, it did really stand out to me this time that the Duke really had no nuance. He was just bad guy.
Yep.
And the first time, I don't think that really, I was so into the emotion of the piece that I didn't really pay attention to that. But this time I did notice that he was very much the caricature of the evil king.
Yeah.
But at the same time, and so I was left kind of with I wish there could have been a little more nuance to that. But to me, it's a beautiful story if you love what some people would consider purple prose. But I really enjoyed the lushness. To me, there's a very poetic sense to the writing, talking about the memories, talking about the food, talking about the flavors. And I really like that kind of thing. I could see other people bouncing off that. And that's perfectly cool, to each their own. But I really enjoyed that aspect of it.
All right. And Rachel, things you liked, things you didn't like, things that you thought were effective, things that were less so.
I really liked kind of the emotion coming through from like Saffron in the story itself. I thought that was really well done. I agree with Beth on the kind of one-dimensional aspect of a kind of opposition in the story that felt a little bit, and also it's kind of like I'm so sorry, but I'm not one of those people who like loves food. I like 3 foods.
Yeah.
And when I go to a restaurant, I pick my one food, and then every time I go back, I pick the same food, right? So
I unfortunately do the same thing.
Yeah, no, it's the same.
But I do that for dietary reasons. So
no, I do it just because my food now. That's the food I've chosen. And if I could genuinely, except for like pizza and like chocolate, like or maybe one additional thing, if I could just take a pill instead, I would. So like the food. So the food stuff for me never quite clicks, I think just because of that. And because I'm more sci-fi than I am fantasy, and this leans way more to fantasy and like historical fiction, I think it didn't click with me just because of that, just because of preference. And again, like Ken said, it's not the story is great, it's me. and how I kind of mix with the characters. One thing I did think was quite nice, because I like doing this myself, is having the main character called something that you put into recipes. So I thought that was quite nice. But yeah, I was just kind of like, okay, but where are the spaceships?
Right.
But
we needed to be spaceships in Renaissance Italy for Rachel and me to like it.
Yeah. So like I did really enjoy it, but there were definitely things that
that didn't quite work.
It just didn't click, just because of who I am as a person, which makes sense. That's what all stories end up being like, right? They're to your personal taste to some extent.
Absolutely. And that's why we have this segment, is because sometimes stories hit and sometimes stories miss, and it all depends on the audience.
Yeah.
We're going to jump a little bit ahead of schedule because I know Ken has to leave a little early. And so I'm going to ask you, Ken, do you have any upcoming or recent projects you'd like to talk about or promote before we go to Beth doing her reading from sorry, not 1,000 recipes, but from A Feast for Starving Stone? Yes,
look at
that one.
Yeah, my ongoing plug is for the podcast. Ken and Robin talk about stuff, available wherever you find podcasts. My current project is we're doing a second edition of Trail of Cthulhu, my Lovecraftian role-playing game at Pelgrane Press. We're working on that right now. It should be kickstarting. We've told people November, but I can tell you it's going to be probably more like February or March that the actual Kickstarter will launch.
Kickstarters are
We'll
a
hope to
pain.
have some quick start stuff in November for people that we've led down the primrose path. And then this fall and winter, I will be annotating a selection of Arthur Machen short stories. So the entire Little People mythos and all of the stories that inspired Lovecraft specifically will be in one collection. That'll be from Arc Dream Press, and I'll be following up my annotated chambers with an annotated Machen. And quite frankly, if I could do one thing for the rest of my life, it would be annotate A-list horror writers from 100 years ago so that people can read them now. And so this is going to be great fun. And hopefully people who like Arthur Machen or like Lovecraft or like annotations will enjoy it.
All right. Well, thank you for having been on. I really appreciate you having been here. He will be back for the Lovecraft episode in 2 episodes. So be ready for more feisty opinions there.
Feisty and somewhat more well-informed opinions. Thanks for having me, Deborah, and it's great to meet all the rest of you. This has been great fun.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Now, Beth, can you give us a reading from A Feast for Starving Stone?
Yes, I can. This is the second book in my series. The first book is 1,000 Recipes for Revenge. That is out now from 47 North. So my trick was to find a reading area that would not be super spoilery, of course, because it is the second book and there are major things that happen in the first book. So I'm going to read part of the back cover, and then I will get to a reading bit that goes into, as I was saying earlier, world building through food, specifically French-inspired food. So, 2 countries at war, a delicious taste of magic, and a fierce princess comes of age in a rousing adventure by the author of 1,000 Recipes for Revenge. Princess Solon's marriage into royalty should have unified the continental neighbors of Verdania and Solon's homeland of Braze against a common enemy, the country of Albion. Thanks to Albion's cunning sabotage, Verdania is now Braze's lethal rival, and the dead Brazian sailors washed ashore near Solon's chateau are just the beginning. Arriving in the midst of danger, Ada Garland, rogue chef to the gods, is desperate to reunite with her daughter Solon. Not only has open war begun, it's become heart-wrenchingly personal. Ada's long-lost beloved Brazian musketeer, Captain Erwin Kor, is now being held in a Verdanian prison with execution imminent. And her daughter has been tasked with the near-doomed responsibility of uniting violently adversarial countries in peace. So that's the basic blurb for the book. Just to repeat something I said earlier, Ada is a chef. That's with a capital C, because it is an important title within her world. She has a magical understanding of food. As an empathetic chef, she can remotely perceive how other people taste food and tailor her cooking to meet their preferences. Her power is enhanced by the grace of the 5 gods who oversee different facets of food and food making within her world. As Ada hurried to the basement kitchen, her heart pounded as if it would escape her chest and raced onward to Verdania. 5 days ago, Erwan had been alive. By the gods, she could only pray he still lived and breathed. After so many years apart, she'd only recently been reunited with him for a single day, and much of that had been occupied by a hard ride culminating in battle. He'd wanted to court her again. Erwan couldn't be dead. He couldn't. And not by the order of that chanker of a man, King Caristo. It was his fault they'd been forced apart. For so many years, she'd been embittered by the separation from her husband and child. She dared to let hope bloom. She couldn't lose that brightness now. Few cooks remained in the kitchen as they completed their labors. When Ada explained her purpose, and that she could complete the cleanup in their stead, the area was readily ceded to her control. Her hand shook as she began to work, but within a minute, she regained her equilibrium. Nothing calmed her like the rhythm and ritual of cooking. A standard Brazian breakfast consisted of buckwheat crepes with fillings to preference, but Yannick and many other musketeers had favored something heartier yet simple. Her first priority was to find the long-handled tool called a salamander, which she set so that its pentagonal end rested over the fireplace coals. That fire continued to burn steadily. Perhaps Hester's attention was elsewhere. Ada brought a long serrated knife through a day-old bread loaf. The crust crackled as the blade came through, crumbs shattering across the table. She topped 3 thick slices with thin cuts of local cheese, aged some 2 months, its texture firm yet pliable. She knew without sampling that it tasted of fresh cream and the earliest grasses of the new year, with a hint of salt from the nearby sea. By experience, she also knew the yellow cheese would melt beautifully. She tucked the prepared slices in the still-hot oven, then pulled sausage from the pantry. The pork intestine case saucisson sec had been made last fall. The white mold that coated the outside was a welcome sign of Gist's blessing. The interior consisted of pork, with only a touch of beef, the coarsely ground mixed including chopped chestnuts, diced dried apples, and a cheese similar to a brie. She sliced the entire length of sausage into fat coins, then checked the oven. The bread had crisped golden on the bottom. She set on a platter and grabbed the glowing hot salamander tool. Standing back, she held the heated end over the melted cheese to create a mottled brown top, just as she would use the same tool for a creme brulee. She had just poured Perry into 2 wooden cups when Yannick came down the stairs. His steps were more assured now. Movement had done him some good, as had time with his comrades. He now wore a musketeer's cassock, his hat in his hands, his clean face creased in a weary smile at the sight of her. "The captain expressed great hope that you'd be in Braze by now," he said, taking a seat across from her at the table, his hat set on the neighboring chair. Her heart physically ached. Oh, 5. Erwin had been asking about her. He wanted to be here with her. The confirmation hurt worse than any stubbed toe she'd ever experienced. "I only arrived today," Ada said. "Much seems to have arrived today. I was just told of the sailors on the nearby beach." Tears glistened in his eyes. "You escaped war, thinking to return to the peace of home, only to find there's no refuge." "I relate to your words more than you even realize. Now eat. I can perceive your drool as you stare at that cheese." He reached for a slice of bread as she did the same. She hadn't eaten since sometime that morning, and she knew she needed the energy for the days ahead. "Where do you expect that your comrades will be imprisoned by now?" Ada asked. She wouldn't give voice to worse possibilities. The cider met his tongue, refreshing in its chill, its alcohol potent and sharp enough to clear more of his fatigue. Ada took her own drink, delighting in the sweetness. Her grandmother would approve. "I thought the tower was most likely. But Captain Core, he believed it'd be the best deal." Ada grimaced. The palace loves to boast that the tower is secure. But the Bastille really is the nastier of those 2 places. The rock-walled dungeon lay beneath the barracks of the palace guards. At any time, a third of the guard was likely sleeping or idling in the building, and she knew that because she regarded the whole facility with morbid fascination when she'd berthed there a few times in her youth. She took another bite of bread, the cheese stretching as she pulled it away. "The Bastille will be problematic," she mused to herself. "Multiple doors, thick walls, hundreds of guards." "You're planning a rescue operation, then?" Yannick didn't sound the slightest bit surprised. "Spring is usually a pleasant time to visit Lutetia anyway. There'll be some nice spring goat cheeses available in the market." "Mm-hmm. For that very reason, Captain Core bid me to tell you that you're not to be daft and make any effort to liberate him on your own. Go to your old friends," he said. So that's the end of the excerpt.
All right.
So
Thank
those
you
are
so
some
much for
real,
having shared that.
that's some real historical implements there, including the salamander tool. That's what they really used for creme brulee and things, 3-4 centuries ago. And that's all integrated in there.
Nice. All right, so we're going to move quickly now to ask you all what you have coming out or recently out that you would like to talk about or promote. And we're going to start with Marie.
So since I had sent in a bunch of Rook and Rose stories for talking about world building here, that trilogy just finished up with Labyrinth's Heart in August, so the series is complete. You can read the whole thing now, with all the possibly excessive chewy world building detail, depending on your preference. I also have The Waking of Angantyr, which is a sort of Norse styled, it's based on a particular poem out of Old Norse literature. It's my Viking revenge epic that is out in the UK right now from Titan Books, and it will be coming out in the US in November, on November 14th. So that
Very
is in the
nice.
process of coming out.
Beth, you obviously have A Feast for a Starving Stone coming out in January. Anything else you'd like to promote?
Well, in the meantime, the first book, it's a duology, so
Yes.
it's just 2 books. 1,000 Recipes for Revenge is out now. You can buy it anywhere. Amazon, of course, is the big lemming choice, and they've certainly been promoting the ebook quite a bit, but you can order it through indie bookstore as well, and it's also in audiobook, which thrills me to bits because none of my previous books were put into audiobooks. So I encourage people to get that and listen to the really beautiful narration that is far better than what I just did.
Rachel, what do you have coming out shortly or recently that you'd like to promote?
So I'm still very much on the kind of promotion wagon for Possible Worlds and Other Stories because it's not a year old yet. It will be soon, and then I'll ease off. But that collection came out December 2022, and I'm currently working on things. So like building up a second collection of short stories with the same press, Ellipsis Imprints. But also I'm working on a novel, and I can't really say say much more than that. But I am working on a novel, and things are very weird and very cool already. So yeah,
That is excellent. All right, so we're going to wind this up with a little preview of next week. Next week will be episode 18, Speculative Poetry 3. We will be featuring the works of Rebecca Buchanan, Alicia Hilton, and Lorraine Shine. We will see you all then. Thank you very much, and we are out. Thank you.